Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Senza Fili Sparring Partners webinar on Open RAN, Choice or Requirement. Our speakers today are Monica Paolini, Principal at Senza Fili, Chris Nicoll, Senior Principal Analyst at Omdia, and Daryl Schoolar, Practice Leader at Omdia. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I will be moderating our webinar today. In Sparring Partners webinars, we watch debaters discuss a topic and answer your questions on screen without slides. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in today's conversation. Please share your comments and questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. All comments are visible to all participants, so please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our debaters will do their best to answer questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not hold your questions until the end. And finally, we'll be live tweeting today's webinar. You can follow along or participate in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #SparringPartners. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
And thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you all for calling in, and thank Chris and Daryl for being with us today. And today we're going to talk about Open RAN yet again. We've been talking about it before, but we thought it would be a good time to talk about it in a slightly different way. So it's not whether, you know, what is Open RAN, but we're just going to go a little bit more into the details. What does make something, what should be, what's the best way to encourage Open RAN adoption? What's the best way to go? And so we're going to take a little bit of a more sort of a deeper dive into the topic. And for that, we have Daryl talking to us. So it's going to be the three of us chatting. And so since you all know Chris, I would like to ask Daryl to introduce himself. And this is going to be a very lively conversation, I'm sure. So Daryl, why don't you tell us, tell the audience who you are, why you're here, why Open RAN, and then we'll go into the discussion.
Sure, thanks, Monica. So yeah, I'm Daryl Schoolar. I'm practice leader for fixing mobile networks at Omdia, and I have the great pleasure of working with Chris on a daily basis. I'm here because you invited me, Monica.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, I mean that's the main reason. But the other reason, yeah, is obviously Open RAN has been a big topic this year. And it's something that I spend quite a lot of time in my own daily analyst job looking at and trying to add some metrics around its adoption rate and discussing the pros and cons and drivers of the topic. So good to be here.
Excellent. And actually, you know, I don't know, I was thinking before we get started, you know, there is all this Zoom over doing, you know, like we're burned out from Zoom and from Open RAN. And I wonder, are we more overburdened by the Zoom meetings or the Open RAN talks? Because there's so many of them.
How about Zoom meetings on Open RAN?
Yeah, exactly. So we are guilty, big time. Yeah. So let's get going with that. So we hope we're not inflicting too much pain on the audience. But so Chris, what are we talking about today? What's the different spin on RAN?
Yeah, so Daryl's actually the perfect person to ask this question to. You know, we've talked about virtual RAN, Open RAN, Cloud RAN, and you got Open Virtual RAN and Virtual Open RAN and all that. So Daryl, why don't you start off by giving us a level set on what is Open RAN versus Virtual RAN, and maybe throw, you know, Cloud RAN in there as well.
Sure, to start with, I mean, I don't know if I really have much distinction between Cloud RAN and Virtual RAN. They're both pretty much used interchangeably to discuss disaggregation of the software from the hardware, which is the virtualization of the baseband functions, and the idea of, you know, taking what, you know, used to be all purpose built on a hardware and software solution, just putting the software on a server of sorts, a common commercial type server that's not based on any RAN vendor. So, you know, and there's different versions of that. There's like what they call V.1.0, which is when you just virtualize what they call the centralized unit. And then there's V.2.0 is when you virtualize the full baseband functions, both the DU and the CU. And I guess probably because, everybody debates terms, maybe, what I've seen right now, a lot of the proof of concepts, they still have it all at the site, both the CU and the DU. Some people might distinguish and say, well, it's not really Cloud RAN until you at least put something away from the site in a data center, generally starting with the centralized unit. But for the most part, I mean, when I look at it, I just lump the two together. Open RAN is actually, in my opinion, just about the O-RAN interfaces. It's opening up the different interfaces that make up the base station itself. Most people start with the front haul part between the radio and the baseband unit. But the fact is, I think there's 11 or 12 different interfaces that can be opened up. And so all those really fall under, in my opinion, kind of the Open RAN definition. But here's one thing to say. I mean, you can have a virtualized network without it being open, and you can have an Open RAN without it being virtualized. But then, the one that most people really kind of talk about, say the Rakuten model, is really, like the open virtual RAN, which is when you have both trends converging together.
Yeah, and I think that, I sometimes think about it like it's like a matrix where you can pick, there's so many combinations in. So if you think about the sort of the new RAN, so where, you don't have a single vendor fully non-virtualized, so if you compare it to the traditional RAN, you have so many different options that it's really difficult to know. And this is good because you want to experiment with different topologies, different architectures, different number of vendors, so that you figure out what works for you. So I think it's a good thing. But at the same time, to just talk about Open RAN as one thing, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you start digging into it. And then depending on what your definition is, your conclusions are going to be different. Not because you necessarily disagree, but because your assumptions are different.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we should go into the first poll. We go before we go too far. So Kendra, why don't you go into that?
All right, our first poll is open. What are the minimal requirements for a network to be considered Open RAN? Support O-RAN open front haul. Support at least one O-RAN interface, and that interface does not have to be front haul. Or support O-RAN open front haul and at least one other O-RAN interface. And if you do not agree with these three options to answer, please feel free to put in your own answer in the Q&A box.
Yeah, and this is a difficult question because we actually spend a lot of time coming up among ourselves with the answers, and we're not even sure they're the right ones. So clearly, if we cannot even agree on what it is, then so just give us your best bet.
Yeah, and certainly there's still a lot of discussion around what is it, and as it's getting developed, there's a lot of other kind of background issues as to defining what is really open, which I think we'll get into in the conversation as well. So interested to see how the audience here kind of picks out.
I think I think some of the answers also vary. I mean, like looking from a vendor perspective in terms of how they would answer it based on what they think their value proposition is. If in some cases, if they think, their value proposition is, hey, we deliver a great, tightly integrated radio and baseband unit, but we're all up for opening the RIC to allow applications in because we have like a big enterprise 4.0 approach or strategy for selling more gear. They would say, yeah, just open up the RIC, that's Open RAN. While in other cases, if you see, really like, hey, we want to bring in all sorts of different radios. Radios are our strengths. We have great radio tech. They may say without the front haul, it's not Open RAN. So yeah, I think this is like one of those great, classic wireless things. The answer is really maybe and where you're coming from.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a closing to the poll here. So Kendra, how about let us know what the poll results are.
Yes, okay, so it looks like we have 56% said support O-RAN open front haul and at least one other O-RAN interface. 28% said support O-RAN open front haul, and 16% said support at least one O-RAN interface, and that interface does not have to be front haul.
Interesting. So maybe again, getting back to the definition thing. So Daryl, how about just explaining to the audience here real quick, what is front haul versus back haul or mid haul?
Yeah, so front haul is the connection between the radio and the baseband unit, or the radio and the distributed unit, while backhaul would be traditionally was from the baseband unit going back to, some traffic aggregation or the core network, or in this case, it would be the centralized unit going back to the core network.
Yeah, and then mid haul is between the distributed unit and the central unit.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, one other thing that I wanted to say, in the question talk about a network, but it really is like any piece of equipment can be Open RAN or not, and then you put them in the network. So you can have a network where all the equipment pieces are Open RAN, but one is not. So the network is somewhat different from what the different parts of the equipment are. And so the question is, does it have to be?
It's interesting though that we've got the audience saying it's not just open front haul, it's open front haul and other aspects of the solution here.
Yeah, they have higher expectations than I do.
So what are your expectations? What do you define as Open RAN?
I think at the base level it's just a single interface. You really could get away with saying it's Open RAN. If you just support some singular one of the interfaces, I think you can legitimately say, yes, you have an ORAN solution, because I'm not really so sure operators want all of them open to begin with anyhow.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be a gradual thing. And in fact, we have Zahid here saying that interoperability is the crucial part, whether it's ORAN or not, it doesn't really matter. And I think that in a way, it really, who cares? I mean, as long as the operator is happy with what they have, and they have their process, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And I think that we wouldn't be having necessarily this discussion if it wasn't for the fact that there is a lot of pressure to adopt Open RAN for funding, for research and things like that. And so it has become sort of like really a very kind of powerful concept. And the thing is that, but the issue with that is that it's a much wider and more important issue. So it's the whole issue of having a new RAN, and whether you call it Open RAN, it's ORAN Alliance specifications or not, who cares, as long as it does what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, but then you get into the complexity though of how do you actually get the different pieces to work together if you don't have some sort of standardization on kind of what is it? Is it the open front haul? And Zahid put a comment in there in the Q&A. Open RAN is just interoperable elements in the network. Front haul, X2 are good, but doesn't have to be Open RAN. Doesn't have to be ORAN.
No, I agree that the standardization is very important, and to have the ORAN, it's a great thing. What I'm saying is that at the same time, there is more than that. So we should not really, I guess we shouldn't tie ourselves to a situation where we just want to have ORAN and only look at the solutions that fit that, especially sort of if you fund research that is going to go for years, and maybe 5 years from now we're not going to have ORAN interfaces because they might be all 3GPP for all we know.
Right, but
that's what I'm
until
saying.
We get to
the question is don't want to be too strict on it.
No, but without some sort of roadmap going forward, the operators are not going to invest in one solution. Then 2 years later, 3GPP comes out with their version, and now is it or is it not upgradable? Did they invest in the wrong, I guess, technology or standards base? And in this lack of, I think, standardization and roadmap going forward, I think could hurt Open RAN and getting implemented in the networks, because operators are not going to invest if they don't know that they're going to be able to take this and move forward with it for 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, I know, like, especially you see it when the split between the radio and the DU, when people talk, it's like a 6.1 split, is it 7.2 split, all the different types of options out there. And how settled are they on? I mean, I think that is one of the things that we've seen in the research and talking to operators that does create confusion. And you've seen it not just in this. I mean, you just can go back to just general virtualization as well, all the different debates of how you do it. So that until that gets settled, I think there is certainly hesitation for it. But to the 3GPP comment, hopefully considering the different the players of ORAN and their role in 3GPP, some adoption at that level, some point that they feed into it, that there's hopefully, you know, as this market gains momentum, that there is coordination there.
Yeah, but at the same time, don't you think, and it's a fine line, but don't you think that having different splits help? Because, you know, but with different splits, the cost is different, the latency is different, and what is available from front haul is not necessarily the same everywhere, even for the same operator. So if you are Manhattan versus rural, wherever, it's going to be different what you have in terms of front haul. So the kind of split you can use.
But I think having too many splits, it's back to the LTE problem when LTE first launched, is you had too many spectrum bands all around the world. They weren't harmonized. I think there's too many splits. And again, it gets back to, so who's your supplier? What's the benefit of it? And what is it? What's the requirement to get that split in place? I think there's, you know, between all the different standards, there's something like 20 different splits, really maybe about a dozen or so that are really kind of well defined. But I think there's only maybe 4 that are in, you know, kind of practical widespread use at this point. So I think we need to, again, focus and narrow down in order to get to some commercial viability here.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, with too much choice is really a problem. It's a real you just, there's just so many combinations you can deal with.
I think limited will definitely help, I think, on some of the, if you want the market to scale. Because you're right, I mean, there are going to be different choices, and there'll always be a certain percent that needs a customizable solution or something very specific to them. But in generally to scale those, especially when you get down to the system integration problems that everybody keeps talking about, there does need to be some sort of narrow focusing where people can look and say, all right, here's the 3 options, or here's the 4 options. We got plenty of experience in doing this so that they can accelerate the deployments.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think about the you know, the funding? So there's research funding specifically for Open RAN. Before we had a whole lot of discussion whether, you know, there should be the funding for rural deployments should be tied to Open RAN, and so that didn't go through. But there's still a lot of push to, in the U.S. specifically, to push Open RAN in general. And I'm personally a little bit uncomfortable with that, because the risk is that we sort of try to get the technology to move faster than it should, and then we might set ourselves up for failure or for more difficulties. You just want to, this is just it's a big change, so we need to make sure we don't do it too fast. I don't know, what do you guys think?
You know, I think it seems to be kind of missing the goal. I mean, it's really ultimately what the goal here, when I listen to the politicians talk, they're talking about trying to create, or, you know, generate, incubate new base station vendors, in this country, particularly American-based vendors, which I think is fine. I mean, I think certainly, you know, funding for research around chips and radios, and maybe giving these companies tax breaks or grants and all that. What I don't get is tying it to Open RAN, because I don't think that's, you know, there's nothing wrong with Open RAN, and I think, you know, there's definitely going to be adoption of it, but I don't think they should totally tie the development of, say, a new group of vendors to that type of technology. One, I don't really trust politicians to define it, and even then, as we said, I mean, this stuff evolves. Are they going to go back and change the definition? And if we went back to, you know, 15 years ago, what if they said, yeah, we want to fund more 3G RAN vendors and they all have to use CDMA or WiMAX? I mean, any of those cases, I mean, I really, you know, think it's good for the government to put out aspirational type goals of here's something we want to achieve, but I'm not particularly a fan of them telling us, here's the roadmap you have to take to achieve it.
Yeah, you have to agree with that, especially on the technology front. One of the things that I think that has helped drive U.S. telecommunications just advancements in leadership is the fact that most of the spectrum licenses are technology neutral, that, you know, we don't have it mandated. Now that's created some challenges as well. No roaming from one network to another, you know, a network provider. and kind of locked into a few different technologies. Now we've all standardized on LTE, but I think that was more market driven than policy driven. And that's where I think the success came from, which is what you're talking about there is, let the market decide, not a specific, kind of political direction.
Yeah, especially because, the funding is going to be done for years. And I think, you mentioned WiMAX. I mean, I think that at the time of WiMAX, there was some talk about having some spectrum being tied to WiMAX. It would have been bad. Especially since then LTE did exactly what WiMAX was trying to do. So it's just a different name for something, a similar concept from a technology point of view. And so I think that we really need to be careful. And to your point, I mean, it's actually very important for the US. If we want to compete with other nations, we need to strengthen our base. This is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And in fact, it should have been done before we had that competition coming in. Although I think it's kind of overrepresented in a way, because we're holding our own. It's not like, we're doing pretty well. But we should support R&D regardless of what Chinese or anybody else is doing. It's a good thing to do, period.
Yeah, but remember, the US has only ever had one major telecom vendor, and that was acquired, and that was Lucent. You've had Cisco and I mean mobile vendor. I'm not talking fixed networks. Optical and IP. That's Cisco and Ciena, and there's a lot of technology there. But as far as wireless goes, that's always been a very, very small group, because I think required by the engineering expertise that's required to come out with the solutions. Now we have antenna providers and developers in the US, vendors, we have some radio vendors, but they're still fairly small. They haven't really scaled up. And Ericsson just acquired a German company, Katrine, for the antennas. So we're seeing a little bit of consolidation there. But we really don't have the Nortel from Canada, the Alcatel from France, the Siemens from Germany anymore. It's Sweden, it's Finland, it's South Korea, and it's China when you talk about mobile infrastructure. So who are we trying to fund here as far as trying to create a solution?
Well, maybe we need to pick our battles. Maybe that's not what, there's just so many tier one vendors you can have in the world. And is it really the best way to promote technology, wireless technology, to just get another tier one vendor? Is that the best way to go? I don't know.
Or is owning the chipset and the stocks, and that's where we want the leadership.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the problems with the base station market to begin with, it is a low margin, high volume business. That's why market share is so important, because and that itself makes it difficult for other entrants to get into the market, unless they have something really unique to offer, which has been kind of the driver of a lot of original Open RAN in terms of new economics, especially for rural deployments, that some of the larger vendors just can't adapt to or make work as well for themselves.
Yeah, but
hey, you forgot Motorola though, Chris. They'll be insulted. Any of your ex-cop friends from Motorola, you left them out of the US one as well.
That's
just
true.
want to throw that in there before we get hate message.
I just don't think of them in terms of base stations. I think they're more on the radio side, handhelds, those kind of things. Yeah, good point. I'll apologize to Kathy when she calls me.
Yeah.
Okay, should we go through some of the questions, or should we go to the second poll here?
How about the second poll, and then we can get some of the questions. Dana's got a good question in there about Dish that we can come back to.
Yes. So why don't we go for the second poll, and then, because I think it's related then to some of the questions. So Kendra.
Okay, great. Second poll coming up. Do you need to have multiple vendors to call your network Open RAN? Yes, at initial launch. Yes, but it can be at a later stage, or no, as long as open interfaces are supported.
And this is a good one too, because it's also, I think, a point in time question relating to the maturation of Open RAN in the ecosystem and the ability to actually pull in, how well do you get multiple vendors to work? And here, I think we get into the question about Dish, and then also you can look at Rakuten as well. to see what did they have to do, especially Rakuten, to get an Open RAN network in place. Because especially with Rakuten, it didn't start as an Open RAN network. It started as a network that I think was really driven by the sheer strength and personality of Tariq and Min, and also the financial backing of Rakuten itself.
Yeah. And keep in mind that they're greenfield, so for them it's easier than for others because they don't have the legacy. And yet, it was a lot of work. So.
And still a lot of work.
Still a lot of work. So it's not trivial.
And one of the points that I keep bringing up about Rakuten is they didn't rely upon the new competitive vendors other than Altiostar, which they had to make a substantial investment in order to get the product out to market. But when you look at who the vendors are supplying the Rakuten network, start off with Cisco, it's Airspan, it's NEC, it's Nokia, it's fairly established large companies. This is not expanding the ecosystem, I think, the way that a lot of the Open RAN proponents were expecting. Not at this point anyway, which is my point about maturation.
Yeah, and they did a lot of work on their own in home. That tells you that there is nothing really out there. So yes, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's not necessarily all done yet. And so that's why I think that we need to be. I'm the strongest proponent of Open RAN, but also let's do it carefully so we don't ruin the thing by just pushing it too far too soon. Okay, I think we have the results. Kendra, can you summarize them for us?
Yes, so we have 63% said that you do not need multiple vendors to call your network Open RAN as long as the open interfaces are supported. 23% you do need to have multiple vendors at launch, and 14% said you need multiple vendors, but those don't have to be there at launch.
So does that mean, so let me ask you this, does it mean that, basically if you are a tier 1 vendor, you just basically check, I'm Open RAN, Open RAN, Open RAN, and nothing changes, so that everything looks like it's Open RAN, but it's still end-to-end, pick your name.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you can do that, you will say it is. It goes back to one of the things I've been thinking, that a lot of this stuff, some of it, operators or plenty of operators may not really want to deal with multiple vendors, but they just like the insurance that it's there in case they have to.
I think that's a really good point. Because in most every mobile network, there's at least 2 major suppliers anyway. They've always kind of traded off. The 60-40, you give one vendor 60%, the other 40%, and then the 40% is incentivized to try to capture share from the 60, and the 60 is incentivized to keep the majority share. Yeah. So that's how they kind of play off on the pricing and things. But we've never seen, there's always been the ability to put in 3, 4, 5 vendors if they chose to. But to Daryl's point, what's the economics of doing that? Because you get into sparring and training, and then the feature roadmaps and feature parity. You need to make sure that you've got the same features across the network. And I think that becomes increasingly difficult to do the more vendors you put in the network.
Yeah, and we've seen examples here in the United States of a major tier 1 operator who one of their main suppliers got acquired by another vendor, and they had to swap out the baseband units, which took up a lot of time and was fairly intensive from what I understand. So there they would have benefited from Open RAN. So even though they ended up with still one vendor after you put in all the mergers and acquisitions that were involved in there, but they did have to swap out a part. So if they had Open RAN, it would have made the swap out easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, the networks. So right now, when an operator has multiple networks, they just split different markets. So in a city, it's one vendor, it's another vendor. And with Open RAN, they could have a little bit more mix, because you might have a city where you might want to have different vendors in different environments. You might use one for, say, some indoor, some enterprise, and you might want to change it through time. So it really gives flexibility. So this is why I think that the concept of Open RAN is important, even if you don't have multiple vendors, because it gives you a different way to approach the RAN today, even if you don't have different vendors, which is going to be very useful in the long term. So to just look at the short-term cost savings of Open RAN, it's very limiting. Sure, let's do it, but there is more than that. The value proposition is more on the long term, and it's more difficult to quantify because it goes deeper.
Well, this is probably a good time to get to Dana's question about what are your thoughts on Dish Wireless, deploying a completely O-RAN 5G SA network. Are they taking a huge risk in doing this because of the unknowns and uncertain outcomes, since there's so many moving parts? Do they really have a plan, or are they just experimenting? Well, Mark Rawan certainly has the plan, but I think the rest of that is certainly up for question. And Daryl, I know you've got some perspectives on Dish.
For one, I don't think it's 100% Open RAN. My understanding, only half the sites are going to be Open RAN. Two, I don't think it's contractually obligated that they do it. I mean, they roll it out, but if it turns out not to be going the way they want to, I don't think there's anything for them to stop and say, well, we're not even going to do 50%. We're going to stop at 20 or 10. I don't have insights in terms of all the contracts and how they're doing that, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there isn't some outs along the way to do it. But if you look at their time frame, I think what is it we're looking at now? Sometime, is it the second half of next year? We're going to see some stuff rolling out.
Like one to three sites by the end of 2021.
1 to 3 sites. Okay, all right.
Or cities, perhaps, but yeah. So we're not talking extensive deployment in 2021, which may play to the strengths of Open RAN, because by 2022, expect to see much more maturation and things kind of working out a little bit better.
But also, going back to our discussion, they again say that their network is all Open RAN, but then it isn't. I mean, it is in a sense that it's in the spirit that they all use equipment that is support Open RAN, but it really is single vendor. So what does that mean? And besides from the fact it's very easy to put out an announcement, it's much more difficult to actually do it.
Well, look at
Rakuten. Have a good record. I mean, and I think that's true for everybody pretty much. You just say something to the best of your. I'm not saying they're lying. I mean, that's what you do. You say, "This is what our plan," and sometimes it takes longer.
Yeah.
I mean, Nokia's got an Open RAN compliant solution but that doesn't prevent an operator from putting in all of Nokia, kind of end to end. Rakuten is open, but again, it's legacy vendors that are primarily providing the equipment, all the way through. Again, with the exception of Altiostar, which is, for all intents and purposes, a Rakuten company at this point, considering how much investment and control they have in the company. So a comment just came in about Vodafone, and actually I think it was in the chat. Yeah, so Fred, if you could put your questions in the Q&A so we don't miss it. You said Vodafone's doing 2,600 sites. Yeah, I think they're doing 2,600 sites over the next 7 years, I think was the, by 2027.
Yeah.
What's the commitment there? So I'm sorry, Pete, sorry, 2,600 sites in the next 7 years is not a huge investment. To me, that's almost more of dipping your toe in the water. Or, and maybe this is a question, how much of a solution is Open RAN really to an operator? Is it 20% of the sites it really applies to? Is it 50 or 75? Where do we think Open RAN really plays for a major mobile operator's network?
Yeah, and but you see like a lot of them, they start doing Open RAN in sort of more rural communities or where there is not much traffic. And I think it's really a very sensible thing to do. You're trying something new where you're more tolerant to learn from it, try different things, make sure everything works, and then move it to other areas.
Rural operator, poor rural customers though potentially get screwed on.
Well, no, because they get better than what they used to have.
Yeah.
If it works,
but even it's not like it's probably not that it works or it doesn't work, but there is some fine tuning to do. So it's much better to do the fine tuning where it's not absolutely crucial to you're running your network at capacity. So all the ones that I've seen, they're sort of like in areas where the operator feels free to do a little bit more of experimentation. It makes perfect sense. What would you do otherwise? this is not to say that it doesn't work. It's just the way you try new technology.
Right. And there's also, I mean, this is kind of where Open RAN started to begin with. And from my opinion, this is where I think right now a lot of the solutions are strongest to begin with, because you didn't bring also the Vodafone sites are LTE that they're talking about deploying. That isn't 5G at all. Or if you look at some of the bigger stuff, like I said, what's going down in Peru right now, I think that's about 2,500 sites that they've rolled out. That's LTE from my understanding. Or you look at some of the other bigger ones that are taking place in Africa. I think what Orange and Parallel Wireless are doing, 4,000 or 5,000 sites together there. From my understanding, a lot of that's going to be LTE. It's not 5G, because that's where the strengths of a lot of the solutions are.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually,
Currently, I should say.
Yeah, there is a
Yeah.
question about using O-RAN for indoor wireless with Wi-Fi 6 and millimeter wave. Okay, so, well, Wi-Fi, it's kind of different, obviously, but you can be in combination with it. I think that Open RAN, there's a lot of indoor possibilities, especially for like what's the name, for enterprise or private networks as well. It's going to be slightly different, but that's also interesting because it's basically a greenfield type of network. So you can have a lot of Open RAN like type of topologies. Right.
It's also a little bit like the rural analogy we just brought up too. I mean, because we saw the same thing with small cells. You put it inside a building. If there is a problem, it does not take out the greater network, or it doesn't interfere with the greater network. You have more of a closed environment to try it out and to see how it works as well. And private, there was the question also that came over on the chat about private networks as well, which I think fits right into there, because we believe a lot of private networks are going to be manufacturing things that are indoors that are going to rely heavily on small cells as well. And this would be a good way for Open RAN, I think personally, to prove itself, because if you look at an operator or whatever, there has to be a reason to change what has worked for you in the past. And one of it's the thing that we talk to death is about CapEx. But to me, cap or cost, but that's a moving target, that if a vendor comes out and offers something 10% cheaper, everybody else is going to catch up to them. So it's just a race to the bottom. Works, I think it's very good for some of those rural examples. But when you start moving into areas that have a different set of economics, I think it's really more about features and functions. It has to be able to do something different than what they can get today to motivate operators as well. And I think as you get to private networks or even indoors, say, whenever we start going back to sports again, but some sort of services or something there that, maybe Open RAN can fulfill that one of the big three can't.
And that's where I think Open RAN has been successful up to this point. Not to say it's not going to be successful moving forward, but stadiums, shopping malls, venues, as you mentioned, manufacturing, distribution warehouses and things, more constrained. Performance is, the ultimate performance. So spectral efficiency is probably not, the primary requirement there. CommScope's done very, very well in this space, and some other vendors as well. When it gets to the mobile operator, you mentioned CapEx, and I think there's an OpEx issue here as well. We talk about 10% or 30%. I was in a customer seminar where the major North American operators were there, and we're talking about swapping out infrastructure, so compute infrastructure. And when you talk about general purpose, and kind of every generation has like a 30% improvement, and the operators went, "Whoa, stop right there! You keep talking 30, 35% like it's significant." I said, "It's not. The cost for me of sparing and training and all the updates and everything else, 30, 35% doesn't cut it." So I keep hearing about, the Open RAN 30, 35% cost benefit over traditional RAN. And I hearken back to that statement of, that's not enough to get us to change. I need an order of magnitude change. And I haven't seen that come out of Open RAN yet. It's good for the rural, as you were saying, and maybe stadiums and things. But if we're talking replacing the whole macro network, I just don't think the economics are there yet.
Well, I think that no matter what you do, to expect for anything new to bring too much of a cost saving in the CapEx, for instance, this is not going to happen. Because first of all, when you look at any TCO model, I've been doing a lot of them, the equipment costs are just like 20%. So the installation cost, no matter what you put in there, it's, it might change a bit, but it's still equipment, boxes, whatever, antennas. So that's not going to change all that much. And if anything, the network becomes more complicated. So back to your point and Daryl's point, you need to have a better, wider view of why you need the change. And it cannot just be the marginal cost savings. Not that they're important, they're an important push, but you need to go and look at, what is the advantage. So the fact that, for instance, you can upgrade in a more gradual fashion is actually a good insurance for future costs. So you need to sort of have a longer view on what it is that you're saving. And this is, I think, for the Open RAN and the whole virtualization, is that it's a completely different approach that allows you to have more flexibility and do different things, so offer new services. That's really the value, I think. So we can talk about the 30% cost reduction, which I just, I just finished a paper just exactly on that. Right. So, right, there is the cost reduction, but the real value is much bigger than somewhere else, I think.
Zahid put a comment in as well from Parallel Wireless. Said a big part of their Open RAN deployments are also 2G modernization, really for power savings. Big motivator to move from 2G to a virtualized Open RAN. So, here, we keep talking 4G and 5G, but, rest of the world, 2G and 3G still have a very, very big play that needs to be addressed. And virtual RAN, Open RAN can certainly, as Zahid was saying here with Parallel Wireless, is a good solution. It's a good, workable, proven solution. That's where that maturation kicks in.
Yes. Yeah, we tend often to sort of be too focused on the 5G big metropolitan areas in the developed world, but that's not all there is to it. And in fact, a lot of the innovation is really coming from these other places, these other countries where they have much more of a constraints, and they can be more willing to take the risks and more willing to really move forward, which is, going back to our race for 5G. I think it's actually, we really need to look at what other people are doing, because they might not be the leading edge, but they might be doing something that is very useful and that we can learn from.
Yeah, and talking about leading edge, so the question came in from D. Shen. What do you think about Open RAN effectively supporting 5G network slicing? And from my perspective, if we're not talking RAN slicing, we're just talking network slicing, then I don't see any issues with Open RAN supporting network slicing, kind of from the CU back into the network. RAN slicing, again, I think that's where Open RAN is going to have some challenges and need some maturation. Same with millimeter wave support. I just think that there's certain areas of the technology today Open RAN can address, but there's others that are more advanced that I think will come over time. But, Daryl, Monica, what do you think?
Yeah, no.
In terms of maturation, I think network slicing needs more maturation probably too before we get into it, or RAN, the full RAN network end-to-end slicing. I think it's a question really, slicing's really about the BSS and the OSS and optimization and AI, things going back in the core. I would imagine, like you said, maturation, and probably though, if you're talking about not the example of, hey, as long as they support open interfaces, but it's one vendor, but if you really do start talking about mixing vendors, certainly I think that increases the level of challenge, because you do have to start pulling data from different vendors. And as we know, not always that data comes through the same way or looks the same way as you start mixing, vendors, because that is kind of some of their secret sauce, as well as, how do they present stuff. So as you're adding more complexity in terms of how you want to run your network and slicing, and then you're actually adding complexity at part of your network, that definitely, mature is the answer for everything here.
So maybe now's a good time, Kendra, if we could hit that third poll, and then we can talk too, because Mark Rowan again was talking about the benefits of data coming out of an Open RAN network. So Kendra, how about launching the third poll for us?
Okay, the third poll: will the adoption of Open RAN increase the market share of new vendors? Yes, new vendors will greatly increase their market share. Yes, but traditional vendors will continue to dominate the market. Or no, the impact of new vendors will be minimal.
Yeah, so one of the things, Intel this week had an industry analyst event, and Mark Rawan had a breakout session where he was talking about just kind of what they're doing at Dish. So Mark Rawan's the CTO of Dish Networks, for Dish Mobile. And he said one of the things that he liked that he saw coming out of kind of the early proof of concepts and trials and things was the amount of data he was able to pull out of the network regarding all sorts of telematics and telemetrics and KPI and SLA kind of data. And I wasn't able to get a question to him to say, how are they standardizing data? Because of course, I think Daryl very astutely pointed out, every vendor is going to have their own set of data that they're pulling out, and some of it's going to be somewhat proprietary to that vendor. So the question is, how consistent and how useful is that data coming from all these different vendors? And then the ability to actually pull the data and use it in some valuable fashion.
Absolutely, and I want to get back to that, but maybe we can get the results first. Kendra? Yes.
Okay.
Can they answer more than one, or is it just one?
No, just one.
I would have answered the first two, both of them.
Okay.
I
The
cannot have that.
results are in, yeah, sorry. It looks like 74% voted for yes, but traditional vendors will continue to dominate the market. 16% said yes, new vendors will greatly increase their market share, and 11% said that there will be minimal impact on new vendors.
So in order, Daryl, to say 1 and 2, what that would imply to me is that the big vendors would buy the small vendors and then keep dominating the market, but also have the other new vendors increase their market share. Or is that, you cannot have both 1 and 2, right? How can you have both 1 and 2?
Sure, because if you start looking at the Open RAN specialists, and if they have 2/10 or 5/10 of market share today, and they grow up to have 5%, that greatly increases their market share. Was it like 100% or something? I mean, I can't do math off the top of my head.
Yeah. Oh, so
but then the other people that still have 80% of the market, maybe they lose 1%. So they still dominate, and mathematically, the other ones have greatly increased their market share.
Okay, next time we will have a more strict.
Mhm.
Yeah, because that's right. If you increase the percentage increase from 0, it an increase.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I get it. Okay. Got it.
But I do think it's interesting that the vast majority of our audience here thinks that traditional vendors are going to continue to dominate the Open RAN market, and I personally agree.
The RAN, or the RAN market as a whole.
Yeah, well, and I think that because I see that the Open RAN is just like a movement, a different concept of the RAN. But basically, you do need volume still. So I think that, but the new vendors are bringing a lot of value to the market. So they might it just happened in the past, and it might happen again. It's going to get acquired, and that's still a good thing because you have the innovation. Basically the acquisition is a way to get the innovation in the system in a way that is more usable for the operators. So I see that's still that's perfectly good way to go if that's what it is. So
So do we think that? No, go ahead, Daryl. No.
Well, I say in terms of acquisition, I mean, there's only a couple of things they can acquire. I mean, they can buy them up to get their customer base, but if they aren't big, they're not going to get much there. And the other question on the innovation I have, if so much of this stuff is being done by different industry groups, whether it's ORAN or people with, on the virtualization side, does that limit the amount of innovation that, one of the big three would get from purchasing versus just basically working within the standards groups that they could create themselves?
Yeah, and actually, so I wanted to go back to this and what you guys were talking about before the last poll in terms of adding the secret sauce issue. So so it's one thing you have this open interface, but then you want to put things on top, and you already start seeing this happening. So yeah, you want to have Open RAN, but then the vendor would say, yeah, but I can do a little bit better if I put something on top, which is true. It's a real thing because the standard is good, but also kind of keeps it down. You cannot have as much innovation.
Mhm.
And I think that there is a question, I think, here moving forward of how you can combine the two and have a good balance. Because if you remember, things like CIPRI started as a standard. There is a standard, there's a specs, not standards, the specs, right? But then everybody kind of diverted from that to make it better. But then you make it better and it's no longer interoperable. So I think that one key challenge that I think we need to face and we need to overcome, and I think it's possible to overcome, is how you balance the fact that you need to have a standard, but also need to have vendors to be able to differentiate themselves.
Yeah, and the differentiation I think is important, but one of the things I think that the operators still struggle with is how quickly can they implement any new technology, any new service. You know, the idea that, you know, like CI/CD, continuous innovation, continuous development, or integration development, there's only so many changes consumers can absorb in a given amount of time as well. So we can have a lot of innovation going on with Open RAN, with a whole bunch of different vendors. But then the question becomes, how quickly can the market, i.e. the operators, actually absorb that integration? And I don't think that that rate is going to be very high. You know, unless it's truly game changing, you can be as innovative as you want, but the ability to actually put that innovation into the market, I think is still very, very low.
Yeah, but there's a lot of like software upgrades. I think there was Rakuten that were talking about how many software upgrades they need to have. So it's more of a continuous process.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a user point of view, you don't know anything about it. So, but the question is that how can you speed up that process, and how can you do it in a way that, you know, not only you have a nominal interoperability, but you can interoperate at the highest level of performance that your equipment can support.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be non-trivial.
We also got to get if it's software change or feature change, it's got to get into the device.
And
so
then,
you've got that upgraded, you know, you've got to go as well. And if it's a new feature or function or service, a new application, again, the user's got to, you know, be able to adjust to this as well. So the fact that Rakuten was getting 2 or 3 software updates a day, if that's feature fix, is great, you know, transparent to the users. If I'm trying to roll out whole new, you know, services, you just can't deploy those services that quickly on an ongoing basis and be successful. Your customers will never know what they're doing.
Yeah. There is another question that it's, do you think about pushing Open RAN in Latin America from a government point of view? And I think that that's the same as in the US. I think it's Open RAN is great, but it should be either mandated or, you know, it's really not in the, I think that the government should just facilitate connectivity rather than a solution. They should encourage, they should make sure that everybody can get connected, get whatever services they need. But how to do it, I think it's best left to the operators to decide what's the best way. As long as you have, you know, you provide the security and all that, but leave it to the operators, I would say. What do you guys think?
No, I disagree.
You say you disagree?
Yeah.
Agree or disagree?
Disagree.
So, okay, tell me then why. Why do you think?
Because this is Sparring Partners, and I've agreed with most of what you said so far. So I just feel obligated by the title to disagree. No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's very similar to like the United States. I mean, in Latin America, certainly, you know, we've seen, you know, some real trials going on there with a lot, you know, the likes of Telefonica. Again, a lot of it's LTE. They have a lot of the same issues as we saw in Africa, where, you know, they've had low adoption, and part of that's probably the cost of the network. Some of it has been just the fact that they've had to wait for the cost of devices to get down and other things as well. But yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, Latin America is not just one giant continuous market. There's different economics and everything going on in every country. But generally speaking, I think they're better off, you know, where they need to set up a goal, and whatever gets you to that goal works. And the government should do stuff economically that they're allowed to legally to help vendors and operators get to that goal. But to pick a specific horse, I think is a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think the UK a few years ago had kind of a broadband mandate of a speed and coverage, so kind of coverage and capacity. They did mandate you had to have optics, you had to have wireless, you had to have LTE or whatever. And I think that's, from a government policy perspective, I think that's what they should be focused on is if you're an operator, you've got a license, you've got certain coverage covenants that you need to meet. And I think that's the way to go about it. And then let the market determine what's the best technology, because it may not be Open RAN. It may be fixed wireless. It may be optics. It may be, pushing bits down barbed wire to get out to a fence or something. But
just to nitpick, Chris, Open RAN does do fixed wireless. That's what they're doing in Peru. This isn't just about mobile. This is actually about fixed as well.
that's true.
Yes.
Very true. Yeah.
Because I know
Good
at least
point.
one person on this call would point that out to us.
Well,
No,
that's
good
the good
point.
thing about the comments from the audience is that they keep us straight if we go if we verge off. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that from a regulatory point of view, it's more important that you want to make sure that if you get somebody's spectrum, they actually use it.
Right.
And again, even that you want to be reasonable about it, because you need to, so you need to create a situation where it's actually cost effective for the operators to deploy their network. So the more restrictions you put, the more potentially you reduce their choice. So reducing their choice is not good. And I trust operators to do a better job than government in picking up their technology, generally speaking. So,
I think Telefonica is doing a really nice job in particular of trialing new technologies in each of their operating countries. They've got a site, and when I say a site, it's about 100 base stations that they're trialing for Open RAN kind of per country to test it out, see how it works out. As Daryl pointed out, LATAM's not one contiguous big market, and I think that's what the operators should be doing is putting Vodafone, 2,700 sites over, 7 years. Let's try it out. Let's see how it works. And if it works really well, I'm sure it'll get broad deployment. And if it doesn't, they'll find something else that does.
Actually, the model, the Vodafone and Telefonica model, I think it's a very good for innovation because they have so many countries, so many different environments that they're dealing with. And so they have a much bigger scope for innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, granted that in the US, we have a lot of variety within the country, but it's useful to be able to go into different, and they're using their their multiple markets to that extent because they have the volume, but the diversity as well within their footprint.
Yeah. I think also not to just look at when we talk about the diversity, it's not just the network, it's actually the different people that work in the different countries and the fact that they have different skill sets themselves. And if you look at the footprint, they're integrating these in many cases into different vendor type footprints as well. So it gives them also the chance to have that experience in terms of what do people need or not need in terms of employee skill sets to make this change, because that's the one thing we haven't talked about. We're also talking something of a cultural change at the operator level, moving into this overall virtual environment. So I mean that should not get overlooked in our discussions as well with this when we talk about Open RAN.
That's a really good point. And that was something that Telefonica, I was talking to them about what they were doing in their strategy. That was a big part of it, was to help overcome local opposition to the new technology, put it in, let them get their hands on, let them get it working. And it was to boost the skill set and expertise in each country. So no, that's a very, very important part, and I think we do overlook that when we put in Open RAN or any other new technology, there is I think a skill set acquisition that has to happen in parallel to make it really work.
Absolutely, and because there is higher risk, so there is from an individual point of view, there is also a question of what do you do when you have to do for more fine tuning that you were used to do, and if you go and you start doing this with say 5G, which is more complex in of itself, you have to. You're absolutely right. Those are going to be just as big issues as the technology itself in terms of moving forward. And said that, we need to split. So anyway, well, thank you guys so much. And I think it's back to Kendra.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, to our debaters today for that wonderful conversation. And thank you to our audience for your lively questions and comments as well. This will conclude our Sparring Partners webinar today. A video version, an on-demand video version, and a podcast will be available on the Senza Fili website in the coming days. And we have 2 upcoming Sparring Partners webinars. The next one will be December 15th, and that will be on what to expect from the new FCC with Mark Lowenstein and special guests Chris Pearson and Louise Perarts. And then in January 7th, we have CBRS Sparring Partners webinar, and registration for those will be available on sensafili.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.